Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my actual office again here on campus. So you know that I'm usually here from 1 to 3 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and nobody ever comes to visit me. So I'm going to start this video, and if things keep going the way they've been going this semester, I should be able to get through it, which is exciting. So earlier this week, I gave you your paper 2 assignment, and I told you I'd put up some sample papers, which I will do today. And then I also sort of talked about this thing called rhetorical criticism that we do. And I mentioned a couple of different methods or lenses that you could use to look at a particular artifact of your choosing, as long as it's mediated and I'd be able to, view it now. That's fine, doesn't matter. An argument between you and your roommate isn't going to work for me, or a family communication of some kind. It has to be a mediated event, so somehow mediated so that I can see it. All right, just want to make that clear for you. Now, your last test, which you all just finished up like 10 days ago, it went up through I.A. Richards. So I'm going to pick up there since that's what your test was over. And yes, those tests I think are graded already. So hopefully that's the case. I will double check on that as soon as I finish this video for you. And so you'll have your grade by this evening no matter what. So since I.A. Richards, you all have been reading a lot, and I know that it's a lot, but the first big sort of theorist that came right after I.A. Richards is Kenneth Burke. And Kenneth Burke is an incredibly important figure in rhetoric, generally, in the study of rhetoric. He is actually a literary critic that was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I feel for him. He was a Catholic. He was raised Catholic, so he had a lot of guilt, and you'll see that come out in his work. He also was married to a woman and had children with her, and then married her sister and had children with her. And so that was a pretty interesting part of his life, but he was a pretty interesting guy. He died when I was about your age, when I was in college. I want to say my sophomore or junior year of college. And it was kind of a big deal when he died. So he is somewhat contemporary. And, when we move out of I.A. Richards, who of course is in the modern, and move towards Burke, these would have not quite crossed paths, but they would have crossed paths, maybe not physically, but their work overlaps. So as I told you, I.A. Richards was interested in miscommunication. You all know that already, because he was interested in understanding how it is that we might fail in sharing created meaning. Well, Burke was actually a literary critic, as I said, so he comes from an English department, essentially, and English studies and literature studies. And the truth is he never had a degree, so he doesn't come from a department, but certainly from the field of literature, writing, and English grammar. So he was all self-taught for the most part after high school. He didn't really go to college. He didn't really like college, but he was the editor of a literary journal or magazine called The Dial. The Dial was a magazine in which literary criticisms were published, and all of the greats were doing it. He was hanging out with Jack Kerouac. He was hanging out in the Village in New York, and was sort of with the beatnik poets. That's what we used to call them, was the beatnik poets. Very interesting history, especially during the 1960s, right? So, of course, one of the things that defined Burke's life is that he was raised during war. He was born right before World War II, I believe. And then he was, he died when he was 96. So no, I guess it would have been World War I. I don't want to mix that up. He was born either right before World War II or right after World War I, somewhere in there. He he lived through Vietnam. He lived through the Korean War. I've got those out of order. He lived through the Gulf Wars even. So he lived in a constant time of turmoil, and that's what he was interested in trying to understand, was how it was that we could not communicate to resolve differences as opposed to going to war. So a lot of his work comes from those positions of guilt and of strife, war, violence, etc. And so out of that, and that's his context, we get this theoretical position, or what I like to call a paradigm instead, of dramatism. Dramatism is a view of the world that it exists as if it's a play. We all function in it as if we're characters in some big play. And if you view the world that way, then you're able to understand the motives of people because you can figure out the motives of characters. Now, in literary criticism, that's what we do. You look at the plot of a story, of course, and the characters, of course, have become actually more important in the 20th century. So the characters became more important when right around the time that he was getting involved in literary criticism. Why is that important? Well, one of the things that people try to discern from these literary characters is their motives, their motivation. What makes that character do what they do? And Burke sort of thought, well, if we can do that, then we can look at the world as if it's a play or a book, a literary work, a drama, and figure out people's motives from there. And so his two biggest, most complete works are A Rhetoric of Motives and A Grammar of Motives, in which he talks about the reasons why and how meaning are created, and where we come from as humans, and also in grammar talks about the way that we can go about sort of dealing with those motives, specifically what is the language of life and of those motivations. So that's where those two pieces come from. He also has done a lot more work, or did a lot more work, but he died before the third book could come out. So those are the first two of what's supposed to be a trilogy. Going back before he was in sort of mainstream writing, when he was still working for the Dial and things of that nature, he actually wrote a piece called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. Now, the problem with that piece at the time was that it seemed to be a defense of Hitler. But if you read it, which I won't make you do, I used to make people read that, but I think it's a little bit too complex or heavy, especially when you're reading all this other stuff from from Burke. So I don't make you read it. I'm going to tell you what that's about, though, because he doesn't defend Hitler, but he does explain where Hitler's work comes from. Now, what work are we talking about from Hitler? Are we talking about the camps? Are we talking about the Holocaust? Are we talking about war? No, we're talking about his original work called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. So Burke took this work, Mein Kampf, from Hitler, and he evaluated it and looked for what motives were driving Hitler, and in the end comes to the conclusion that the truth is we all should have seen it coming. And by it, I mean the Holocaust, I mean World War II. Now, I don't know how accurate that is, but his interpretation makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to address that work first, even though I didn't have you read it, because in it, he develops one of his theories, really, under the blanket paradigm of dramatism, and that's called the guilt redemption cycle. So in the guilt redemption cycle, he essentially argues that we all live in this symbolic world where words mean things, where the things that we say are driven for a reason. And then he says we often violate that order. What does he mean by violate that order? Well, we take a misstep. We do something that's not considered socially acceptable, or we say something out of turn, or we flub up something. But the severity of that violation depends on where you did it, how you did it, who you did it to, and what that perception is and who saw it, and so on. So, for example, when a presidential candidate has a major gaffe, like they say something completely wrong. Although all of America's eyes are on that presidential candidate, right? So we know every single detail of what happened, and it can make or break a career, okay? For us, it might be something more simple. For example, if you took a test and you got an F on it, just completely failed it, that would be considered a violation of the expectations of your symbolic order, is my guess, since you're here. And if you, for some people, it's like if I didn't get an A, I'm violating my entire order. I have to get an A. And of course, there's a reality of symbolic order. There's the symbolic order that we create for ourselves. And in this case, not getting an A, getting a B, for example, does not violate the symbolic order at all. It may violate your personal expectations, but it doesn't violate the symbolic order. And so what's the first thing we do when we fail a test? Well, we do one of two things. Either one, we do what's called taking responsibility and saying, okay, I screwed that up. Here's what could have been done. Here's the lesson I learned from it. So it's sort of what Burke calls mortification. So I'm the one who's wrong, and transcendence. So those two go kind of hand in hand. The idea that I would take the blame, but I would also explain what good can come out of it. And once I do that, I've been through a social purification, and I can rejoin the symbolic order right back where I was. The alternative to that is to blame, right? Scapegoat is what Burke would call it. Scapegoat and blame everybody else for what happened. Oh, the teacher was unfair. The test was unfair. I went out and partied the night before. Why can't people understand that? Whatever the excuse is, we will blame those external sources for why we failed the test. That's not called mortification. That's called it's not victimization, although it kind of is victimization, and then transcendence. So we scapegoat. We say everybody else is some people would say we can reach transcendence through scapegoating, because we could say, well, this wasn't my fault. That would obviously be a different kind of transcendence than the mortification transcendence. So this scapegoating sort of allows us to rejoin the symbolic order as well. We go through this purification ritual of going around and fixing it. And then we rejoin the symbolic order and everything's right in the world again. So let me tell you an example of a day-to-day how this might happen. When I first came here in 2006, I looked a hell of a lot younger, and people often mistook me for like a student, particularly a grad student. And so I would get into the elevators, and you're not really supposed to talk in an elevator. That used to be the rule. That's not really the rule anymore. People break that all the time. But at the time, it was like you didn't talk in an elevator. There was no music playing in the elevator. And I would get in there and people would be going, oh my God, listen to what just happened. I totally failed my test. The teacher did this. I did this. I don't know if it was fair or not. I think it was fair, but I didn't study. And oh my God, I'm just going to be in trouble. Or I have to go call everybody I know. That was one that I heard a lot, was this idea that I had to go and confess, right? I had to go tell everyone that this happened. In other words, yeah, I violated the symbolic order that I live in. No one needs to know, but I'm going to go tell them all that I did this. And at that point, you can choose whether or not you're going to be going through a process of mortification or of victimization, right? Scapegoating. So you choose whichever one. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I would choose different things. I might tell my friends, oh my God, I totally failed that because, I went out last night. I was playing euchre or D&D or whatever it was I was doing in college, and I was over in the other dorm until 4 o'clock this morning, so I could not take that 8 a.m. philosophy exam, so I totally bombed it. Whereas I might tell my parents, well, here's what happened. I studied, but I apparently studied not the right things, which we all know is a bunch of BS, right? But I'm sort of trying to repair the symbolic order, the relationship with my parents, and make sure that it stays intact. So I'll scapegoat. So I might tell the people that I know right in front of me a different story than I tell my parents. That is because those two groups, my friends and my parents, existed in two different symbolic orders, right? In the symbolic order of my friends, I have to maintain that I am cool, and that, there were a lot of cool reasons why I didn't, pass this exam. Now, they aren't cool, but at the time when I was in college, I thought they were, so that was enough. Whereas my parents, I had to justify the fact that we were spending $20,000 a year on an education that I like to goof up on regularly when I was in college. So lots of mistakes were made, as I say a lot, and a lot of forgiveness was asked for, a lot of mortification went on. But let's be fair, when it came to my friends and my social circles, a lot of victimization was going on, a lot of scapegoating, right? So whenever people would come into the elevator, that's what they were doing. They were there to confess what they were doing, either in the elevator or calling everyone that they knew. And honestly, I don't think they knew that I was a professor, because once I started to get older and let my hair go gray and such, they stopped doing that so much. And of course, you don't want to get into an elevator with one professor and be talking bad about another professor. That's just not a good scene. That's a true violation of the symbolic order, in the sense that you would have to do a lot of work to get back from that. It's not a smart move on anybody's part. So let's look at this process. You start off with the symbolic order. You're in a classroom and you're taking an exam for a course that you're taking that you're paying a lot of money for. Then you violate that order. You fail the exam. So you have to engage in some sort of purification ritual, such as, that victimization and scapegoating, or the mortification and transcendence process. And you go through that as a purification ritual. What is it that we're doing? We're confessing. We're telling everybody what happened. And then you rejoin the symbolic order in whichever way is accepted, right? That particular symbolic order. And that's how the guilt redemption cycle works. One really good paper I got in one of the first years I started teaching used the guilt redemption lens. And it was looking at, I think at the time they were called the Dixie Chicks. Now they're just called the Chicks, I think. I haven't listened to pop or popular music in a long time, so I don't know if they're even still around. But the Dixie Chicks at the time had an incident where they were at a concert in, I believe it was London, and the lead singer, Natalie Maines, made a comment like, "We're embarrassed that our president is from our home state of Texas." And at the time, the president was George W. Bush, and we had just been attacked, I believe. And she was making comments about how we responded, and all the people in London cheered her. But when she got back to America, to the United States, people went off on her. Toby Keith had a huge push to ban all of their music, and radio stations were burning the records. Or the CDs, whatever. They were destroying them. They were destroying the digital recordings if we had them. I don't think we did yet, but we were close to that. So their reputation just devolved. And so years later, they came out with an entire album that was based off of their song, Not Ready to Make Nice. And essentially what they were saying was, we stood by what we truly believed. We were not going to say something that we didn't believe. It is not anti-patriotic to be critical of your government's choices when it involves war. So this song, though, Not Ready to Make Nice, was directed, we felt, pretty much to Toby Keith, I'm not ready to tell you it's okay. Because destroying my career, destroying our reputation was not okay. And the album did extremely well. It was really popular. The song was super popular. I'm not sure if people knew what it was really about, but it was definitely their attempt at purification. And different songs take on different tacks, right? Like A couple of the songs would be all about mortification. It's our fault that we said this, or it's our fault that we sent that message, or we didn't realize the influence it would have, versus some victimization of, it's not right what Toby Keith did. It's not okay to tell us that we can't have freedom of speech. We're supposed to have freedom of speech, especially across the globe. That's the whole point of being in the United States. So there was a lot going on there, but this purification ritual, which was the album, one might say got them to rejoin the symbolic order because the album did really well. But the problem is that their reputation never became what it was. And I don't know, I haven't heard from them in a long, long time. And certainly having a name like the Dixie Chicks was in, probably about 5 to 7 years ago, became a pretty big deal. That's when people started taking Dixie out of the Dixie Stampede. They started taking Dixie out of the Dixie store that was in Branson. And my husband actually went to a high school in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where he was raised, called Southside High School. And they had the image of Johnny Rebel and the words Dixie in everything. And they actually got rid of Johnny Rebel as their mascot. They went to just being called the Rebels, and they got a different mascot. I don't know what it was that they got, but it wasn't sort of hearkening back to the Civil War anymore. So we had that movement, and now you'll notice that it is Dolly Parton's Stampede. It's no longer the Dixie Stampede. You'll notice that they are not the Dixie Chicks, they are the Chicks. So as we have evolved and reordered our symbolic order and what things mean and how they mean them and what impact that has, we see changes in the public discourse surrounding these ideas. So that is one of the ways that you can analyze an artifact, is to look at it and say, does it fall within the dramatistic paradigm? And if so, does it fall under the guilt redemption cycle? There are a few other theoretical positions or lenses that you can also grab from dramatism. One of them is the theory of identification, which I see less as a rhetorical lens and more as just a theory. So I told you Burke was born during war. He lived through so many of them that he was basically like, okay, what separates us during a war? Well, a bomb, a shooting, a violence of some kind that breaks the relational bond between two countries in this case, or more. And then how does a war get settled? Well, it gets settled very simply by a decree, right? A treatise, a peace treaty, something along those lines. In other words, words, an agreement, verbally and written. So Burke started looking at all of the way humanity is brought into the world. All of us are brought into the world separate, right? We're separated from our mother. We're separated from our siblings if we have them. We are literally taken out of the sort of unifying experience that we all would have and put into the world as individuals. This would be true even for identical twins and conjoined and all manner. Those twins don't share the same brain, so they're separate entities. So how is it that then, if we're all individual, that we manage to do things? Burke's example is we build a bridge. How do we build a bridge? You have to have communication on both sides going both the same ways and some level of agreement in order to get a bridge over a body of water, for example. So you've got land on this side, you've got land on this side. How are you going to get it to connect? If these people over here start building and they don't tell anybody what they're doing and these do the same, you're going to have a bridge that probably doesn't connect, that's disjointed, that is impossible or difficult to drive over or walk over, whatever the goal is. So we have to reconnect in order to function in the world, in order for humans to function. So what is the way that we reconnect after being pulled apart from each other? That answer is pretty simple. It's by identifying with others. These days we call it empathy, but Burke didn't get into the psychological emotions of it. He was just looking at the language of it. So for what we mean by identifying is not just saying, oh, there's a human over there, but by identifying that that's a human. And if that person said hello, that they are reaching out to you. And so you recognize them and say, yes, you are here on this earth. Hello. And sometimes that's all identification takes, is just that recognition that you're both on the same planet. And that's good enough, because you don't really need to sit down and discuss everything that relates the two of you together. You might not even know the person really well or at all. Maybe it's just someone you passed in the hallway several times and you made eye contact. If you're from the Northeast, that's always a mistake. But here in the South, people like to make eye contact. They like to be nice to each other. They like to say hello. And so we really get the sense that if you're walking down the hallway and I'm walking down the hallway and you say, hey, Dr. Dudash, how's it going? And I just don't even, maybe I don't hear you. I'm old, my hearing is going, I'm distracted, maybe I'm thinking about something. You're going to see that as me not recognizing you're even on the planet. And that might make you feel like we're more separated than we already are. Whereas if I say hello back, then I am acknowledging that you said hello. I am reaching back out and trying to connect and identify with you that, yes, we're both people on the planet who said hello. Well, that's all well and good. But the theory of identification also wants to get at how we persuade each other to work together. So the theory of identification ends with persuasion. So how do we get from saying hi in the hallway to persuasion? Burke says there's several levels of identification. The first is just sort of that superficial, hey, you're on the planet. We both need air to eat, to drink. We've got real simplistic connections or shallow connections between us. And if I'm trying to convince you to give money to people who are hungry, that's probably all I need. You know they need to eat. I know they need to eat. We all know they need to eat. Let's get them some food, right? That's an easy persuasion tactic that happens at that real superficial level. The next level is common ground. That is, what is it that we actually share together that impacts our needs and therefore our need for persuasion and our willingness to be persuaded. And those are things that are sort of conditional or about the context in which you're in. We're in school, therefore we probably value learning, but that's not even important right now. What's important is that we're all in this class setting and maybe Blackboard goes down. Well, that impacts all of us. So we might want to persuade each other to get into a different system. Like we're starting with, what is it, Brightspace, I think, in the summer of 2024, because we need to make improvements to Blackboard. And we convince each other of that. It was sort of sorted out because we were identifying the shared problems that we were all having with Blackboard. And so that's sort of that common ground level. We all share this one thing in common with each other. To go deeper than that is where Burke says that you get at pure persuasion. You won't even have to work to persuade people. And that is called consubstantiality. So I'm going to spell that for you. consubstantian. Wow, consubstantiality. Tiality. There we go. That's a lot. That is not a word that you hear a lot, and it's not a word that you're going to use a lot, and it's not a word that I would ever want to hit in a spelling bee. So consubstantiality, con meaning with, that's Latin for with, substance, obviously. You could think of it in terms of a material thing, of our actual substance, or you could think about it as in substance, those things that we believe in below the surface. And then it is the process of, right? So you have the process of sharing, or the process of getting with another human at the level of our substantive values. So going back to the example I've been using of education, we're not all just at MSU, we're not all just using Blackboard, but we're also here probably, most likely, because we want knowledge or we want to learn. Those are our deeper values. If you come into the classroom in one way or another just wanting information and a grade, that's very different than if you go into it wanting to learn and to gain knowledge, okay? But so those are sort of more substantial, below the surface values. Consubstantiality then is that process that we go through where we've reached people at that core substantive level of value sharing. And at that point, you need to do very little to persuade someone to act with you. Maybe you want an example of that as well. So here's one. When I first moved here in 2006, I felt like every other station was a religious talk radio station, basically. There wasn't a whole lot of a good selection of music stations. There's more now, but I used to hit scan on the radio in my car and just run it through, and it would run through, and I'd get like 10-second snippets of these different things that were on the radio, whether that was an advertisement, music, or talk. And every now and then something would grab my attention. So one day this station grabbed my attention. It was a woman who had worked for insurance companies for many years, and she wanted to start sort of a supplemental insurance company that was based on the number of members that joined. So essentially supplemental insurance like Affleck or something along those lines, but it would come from the people in your community so that, you guys have this big pot of donations essentially that you can use for extra coverage, extra insurance. And so she was asked why, and she tells this horrible story about a major insurance company that she worked for. I'm not going to mention any names, but she went to corporate one day because she had a patient, a man who needed a heart transplant in order to live. And the insurance company kept saying, no, he can take this pill and it will give him another year. So he can just take the pill. Now, a heart transplant at the time would cost anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. So $1 million is a lot of money, $500,000 is a lot of money. And so the insurance company said, we're not going to cover that. And she was very upset about this. And so she went to corporate and walked in, and there was this huge sort of monstrosity in the middle of the foyer where she walked in. The information desk was and everything, and it's this big grand building, right? It's huge, and there's this drapery over this thing that's in the middle of the lobby area. And so she says to someone at the desk, what's going on here? And they said, we're going to be having an unveiling tomorrow for that. It's a statue that we got. And she said, and the person said, yeah, it's a $2 million statue. And at that moment, she realized that the values of her company were probably not the same as her values. And so she left the company and she started going around to a bunch of different places and asking for money for this other supplemental insurance idea. And she said, of course, my first thought was strategically to start with churches, right? All kinds of churches. And so she did. She started going into all these churches and saying, hey, we need to do this. And she wasn't getting a lot of positive response, not a lot of positive feedback, not a lot of people motivated or persuaded by her. So she was like, what am I doing wrong? And she said she sat down and she thought about it. And she realized that just because people go to church doesn't mean they're going to want to contribute to this fund. Just because someone identifies as Christian does not make them want to give up their money any more than any other thing would make you want to give up your money. And so what she decided to do was start using, I guess, scripture essentially to go in and say, God says that we are stewards of the earth. Jesus told us that we have to love one another as we would love ourselves, that we should treat others as we want to be treated, that we have all these responsibilities under the Christian religion. And there's obviously other religions that have similar ideas that you should take care of your other humans and animals and things like that. And so she started doing that, and all of a sudden people in the churches started giving her money because she was able to identify with them on a much more substantial level than just we're all in a church together. That wasn't enough. So she had to dig deep into the substance of the values of these people. And this would be true no matter where she went, right? You would have to know the motivations of your audience and how to persuade them if you were going to big corporations, if you were going to other nonprofits, if you were going to other insurance companies. Like, all of these audiences have some sort of shared value that you need to reach and tap into in order to persuade an individual, let alone a whole group of individuals, to your way. And so that's the theory of identification, that if we're able to figure out what those shared values are and we're able to utilize them, then we're going to automatically have persuasion. And I think that's a pretty good proof or piece of evidence for how that works. It's pretty clear to me how that works. So again, the theory of identification, you find sort of the superficial things that you have in common, the fact that we're all human, whatever, the basic needs. If you're into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these would be like the bottom level, right? The most basic things that we need. And then you would move on to common ground. What are the things that make you and me similar? And then you would move deeper into substantive values. And that's where you reach consubstantiality. The goal of consubstantiality is persuasion. Okay. The next position that I'm going to talk about from Burke and out of dramatism is going to be the most obvious one, which is called the pentad. It's called the pentad because there's 5 parts. So there's actually 6, which is interesting. So let's talk about that. If you've never heard of the pentad before, it's essentially looking at the world as a drama and then looking for the who, what, where, when, why sort of things. But he calls them the scene, the act, the agent, the agency, and the purpose. The act is what that character does. The scene is where that happens, including everything in the rhetorical environment, which would be power relationships, as well as like in an office or in a classroom or whatnot. You have the agent, who is the person doing the action. You have agency, which is what gives them the ability to take that action, to do this thing. And then finally, purpose, why they're doing it, which, if you're looking for motive and you know the purpose, don't you know the motive? I don't know. Burke says no, and here's why. If you're wondering what the 6th one is, it's attitude, the way you go about doing it, not just how you do it, but the way you go about doing it. And even Burke was kind of like, yeah, I guess so, and sort of threw it off to the side. When I watched a video of Burke talking about this, he was very, very drunk. And so there were a lot of words that were slurred. And yes, I watched Burke on VHS at one point in my life. I don't know that we have that anymore. I don't know if it's available, but he wasn't making a heck of a lot of sense when he talked about that 6th part of the pentad. But other scholars in the field had picked up on this 6th idea. So sometimes we'll say the 6th is attitude. I'm not really big on that. It doesn't matter to me whether it's something that you address or not. What is important is that, yes, knowing these 5 things is great when you're looking for the motives behind why people are doing what they're doing, why a song says what it says, why a songwriter writes a particular song, and why we take particular actions, even interpersonally. When we view them as a drama, those 5 things are very important. But remember when I just said, if you know what the purpose is, then what else do you need? Well, Burke is very clear about this. And he says that you can't just fill in those 5 and plug and play and say, okay, we understand this literary work, or we understand this artifact now. He would say that the most important part of the pentad, the most important part is ratios. Ratios is literally the relationship between 2 or more of those 5 things and how they explain the action. The most commonly used aspect of the pentad is the scene. The scene almost always dictates how something's getting done, why it's getting done, who's doing it, and who has the agency to do it. So it's usually like a scene-act ratio, or a scene agent ratio, or a scene agency ratio. Those combinations of things, those ratios, the way that one applies to another or is in relationship to another, is what explains motivation. Okay? So the pentad has these 5 parts of scene, act, agent, agency, and purpose, and possibly attitude. But it's in understanding the relationship between those things that we can come to conclusions about the motivation of a particular act. So a lot of that is what you read, and so I'm trying to think of what the 3rd book was called. I think it was a symbolic of motives or something to that effect, that 3rd one was supposed to be. And I don't know what would have come out of that we hadn't already learned from Burke in The Rhetoric of Motives, The Grammar of Motives, and in The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. So I'm going to leave it there and say Burke's general paradigm of dramatism can be applicable to almost anything, especially when you're looking for persuasion. And using one of those 3 methods of the guilt redemption cycle, the theory of identification, or the pentad will help you explain why your conclusions about this particular act are true. Now, I want you to remember that in a rhetorical criticism, your job is to convince the reader that your interpretation of that particular artifact is correct. And so, can you be wrong? I guess. But your paper is going to be graded on its form, on its on its substance. Just, did you make a good argument for why I should see this artifact a certain way? I'm going to be looking, yes, at grammar and all those things, APA, SAL, everything that's on that matrix that I gave you from even your paper 1. But what I'm not going to do is say, you're absolutely wrong, I'm giving you a low grade, because there's no way for me to disagree with you on your opinion. The only thing I can disagree with you on, if you want to look at it as disagreement, is to critique the argument that you're making. So please keep that in mind, that you, when you write a rhetorical criticism, are trying to persuade me of your interpretation of that particular artifact. I'm going to tell you about another artifact that got a lot of attention when I first moved here. It was the song, I'm sure you don't know it, but it's a song by a band called Hinder, Hinder, and that song was called Lips of an Angel. And at the time, I had people arguing that it was an ethical action that he was taking, and others argue that it wasn't an ethical action that he was taking. And that was those were interesting papers to read. And then, it's hard to take on something that complex, trying to figure out the action in a particular artifact or why a certain artifact exists, especially when we move into more postmodern artifacts, which I'm going to talk about the next time that I do a video for you. But For right now, Burke is not the first postmodernist either, although some consider him postmodernist because it's all about interpretation and the individual. I would consider him pretty modern because he has these formulas and these models and these steps that we must take in order to evaluate success or lack of success of a particular artifact, particularly in terms of persuasion. So you read also about Stephen Toulmin, and I will also talk about him in the next video as well, because understanding how arguments work, very modern, not postmodern at all, and actually applicable to Burke. So we'll talk more about that next time. I hope you all have a very happy Thanksgiving, and I'll check you when you get back.